And thank you all for taking some time to discuss a topic which is becoming more important and more urgent every year, climate change. But I'm here with very good news for you. We have a solution for climate change in the form of a bipartisan bill that's in Congress right now, ready to go. All we need is the political will to push this bill forward. So I'm going to start with a lesson from grade school. Everything that's important to know, we learned in grade school, right? And when I was growing up in a suburb of Chicago, I lived about 1.5 miles from my church and school. And most days I would take the bus, but when I was feeling adventurous, I liked to walk home. Now, I don't know how many youngsters there are out there, but there was no GPS, okay? There was no cell phone. The technology I had was a map in the yellow pages of our phone book, and from that, I made a little diagram for myself, just copying down only the streets that I needed to get from school home, right? And so I would snake my way around, but once in a while, of course, I'd make a wrong turn. And what did I learn? Well, all of a sudden I realized the street corners I'm looking at aren't on my map. What am I supposed to do? Well, of course, when you've left the map, you got to turn around and go back. And that's what I did until I found the right street and street names that made sense and found my way home. So the lesson we have from this is that a map keeps us safe and shows us that we're on the right path. And when you realize you're off your map, you need to go back. Well, here's our map for climate change. What you're looking at, and I know the graph's kind of small, I apologize for that, but this is a plot of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. And what you see is cycles going up and going down. Those are the ice ages that we're all familiar with. And that's natural. But what you see is that the highest that level reaches is 300 parts per million. And where we are today is not natural. This is climate change. We're now at 410 parts per million, well above anything over those last 800,000 years. So now, literally, we are in uncharted territory, right? Human society has never lived in a climate that we're in right now and that we're heading toward. So we have to go back. How do we do that? Well, before we talk about technical details, let's remember this is not just a scientific discussion or a policy discussion. This is really fundamentally a discussion about values. And Rotary values align very well with the values that we need to bring to solve this problem. First, we ask, is it the truth? Well, the scientific consensus that we're causing dangerous warming is nearly unanimous, and that comes from burning fossil fuels. Is it fair to all concerned? Well, one of the things that motivates me is that millions of people who did nothing to cause this crisis will suffer the brunt of it and suffer the most. So certainly, it is fair for us now to look at how we can resolve this issue. Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Well, actually, yes. We're going to need to bring together a huge coalition of people from all different backgrounds in order to solve this problem. There's nothing that I can imagine better than this for breeding goodwill in our country right now. Will it be beneficial to all concerned? Well, everyone needs a stable climate for food, shelter, water, all of these things, right? So this is definitely going to be beneficial for all concerned. Let's take a minute and just talk about science. So as many of you probably know, most of the energy we get comes here from the sun in the form of sunlight. It's absorbed by the earth, warms the earth. The earth then starts to radiate that out as heat or infrared back out to space. But there are gases in our atmosphere called greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide and water vapor, which trap that heat. They absorb some of the infrared and they re-radiate it back to the surface of the earth. And this is all a natural balance that keeps the earth at a stable temperature that sustains life. But what we've done now, since the Industrial Revolution, is alter that balance and throw it out of whack. We've put so much carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere that we're trapping too much heat. This is global warming. We're overheating our planet, our home. One of the most easy ways to see this is to take a look at these NASA pictures of the ice cover of the Arctic Ocean. And what you see there in 1984 is a lot of coverage. It's all covered with ice and a lot of thick ice. You see the very white color there is the old thick ice. Then you fast forward to 2016, and first of all, you've got a lot of open water not covered by ice at all, plus you have a lot of the other ice that's still there, but it's very thin, young ice that's getting ready to break up. So within my lifetime, we have lost 70% of the volume at the North Pole of the ice on the ocean there. Now, is this just a problem for polar bears, or do we care? Well, it turns out we're all connected. So this ice loss is heating the entire planet even more than it otherwise would have been heated, because ocean water absorbs twice as much sunlight as ice. And so this effect now has essentially added as much warming as 6 years of human emissions. So what we are doing there is we're setting off dominoes that we are not going to be able to control. So prudence would suggest what we need to do is reduce our emissions, something we can control. Let's talk about now some of the impacts. Now, you're probably familiar, of course, with sea level rise, coastal flooding. We've all seen the Australian wildfires in the news, but let's talk a little bit about the Midwest. So the way we see climate impacts here is primarily through precipitation. Because the Earth is warming, we're evaporating more moisture from the oceans and the land, and also warmer air can hold more moisture. So when that moisture finally encounters a cold front and comes down as rain, we get a lot of heavy downpours. And the map is showing you there that in the Midwest we have 40% more heavy downpours now than we had in 1958. And what's happening as a result of this? Well, one consequence is urban flooding. Because a study showed, for example, in Illinois in 2015, that 90% of the flood claims from urban flooding were not in mapped floodplains. So you get these heavy downpours, you have old storm sewer systems that weren't built for that kind of rain, and all of a sudden your basement is backing up. Now, there are other factors. I mean, urbanization, sprawl, paving over land, that plays a role. But these heavy downpours from climate change are certainly a big part of the problem. Other issues related to precipitation. I know you've been speaking here in the club a lot about Lake Erie. It's an issue dear to all of our hearts. So we know the primary cause is runoff of fertilizer from farm fields. But climate change is also playing a very important role. The heavy downpours that I was just talking about, think about it. You have fertilizer spread on farm fields. You have a soft rain, fine, it sort of percolates into the soil and gets absorbed. But if you have a heavy downpour, it just washes everything off straight into the Maumee River and into the lake. So you've got more fertilizer being run off, plus you have higher water temperature, which also breeds bacteria. And both of these factors are increasing the algal blooms. So you can see from the picture here in 2005, there was a dry spring, not a very heavy algal bloom there. But in 2011, a very wet spring, and you have a major bloom. So climate change, we can say, is a threat multiplier, just as the Pentagon describes it. It's taking existing dangers that we have, and it's amplifying them. Another issue related to precipitation. Many of you, I'm sure, remember last spring, okay? It just would not stop raining. Now, if you're a homeowner, maybe that meant you couldn't mow your lawn, and it was kind of an inconvenience. I know it was for me. But if you're a farmer, it's more than an inconvenience. So if we look back at this diagram again, we can see that we were almost in a bullseye here in Toledo. Very heavy precipitation hit us and some other areas. And 40% of the farm fields in Wood County, 40% could not be planted last year. And it's not just a fluke. It turns out that we've lost, on average, 5 days of field work in the spring and 5 days of field work in the fall just since 1995. Why? Because the fields are too wet to work in. And if you zoom back out to the full view, you'll see there's a picture of Greg McGlinch, a farmer in Dare County, and he's just staring. Can we go to the full view of the slide again? He's just staring at a field that he's not able to work. Okay? So again, there are other factors affecting farmers, but climate change is definitely making an impact. So what is it that we need to do? This plot shows us we need to go to the heart of the problem. We need to go to the carbon dioxide emissions. This is a plot of emissions as a function of time. And you see the black dark line is the historical average. So this is where we've been, and there's an increase over time. Now, if governments had not done anything, we'd be along that grayish path going up toward 4 or even 5 degrees Celsius of warming, truly disastrous. Fortunately, governments have started to act, companies are starting to act, and we're starting to bend the curve a little bit. We're on sort of that bluish path there, which is saying what current policies are going to do. And you can see the emissions will peak in another couple decades and then start to gradually decrease. The problem is that is good, but not enough. That will get us to about 3 degrees C of warming, still far more than we can handle. Right now, we're only 1 degree C warmer than pre-industrial times. We don't want to go to 3. So what we need to do are those paths you see at the bottom there. the yellow and the green path, which bring us down to about 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees C of warming. That means we need to cut emissions 50% in 10 years. Now, I realize that sounds extremely daunting, but I'm here to tell you we can do that. We can make this change. So how do we do it? We do it with this bill, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It's called a carbon fee and dividend policy. And I'll explain how it works, but first I want to tell you why we like this policy. First of all, it's effective. Just this policy by itself is estimated to cut emissions by about 40% in 12 years. One bill. It's good for people. It's going to put money in people's pockets, and it's going to protect human health. It's actually good for the economy, too. It's going to grow the economy, create new jobs. We're going to see investment in all the cleaner technologies that we know we need to develop, and then we can lead the world in those. It's revenue neutral. It doesn't grow the size of government, and it's bipartisan. You might be interested in knowing that 2 of the members of our advisory board for Citizens Climate Lobby are George Shultz, who was Secretary of State under President Reagan, and Bob Inglis, a former Republican congressman from South Carolina. So let's talk about the policy itself. First of all, there's the fee. It's a carbon emissions fee placed on coal, oil, and gas wherever they are produced, so at the coal mine or the wellhead for the oil. It starts out low, and it grows over time. So, for example, in the first year, a gallon of gas would cost about 16 cents more. But by the end of 10 years, it would be $1 a gallon more. All right? So this structure of the fee allows for a period of transition while sending a clear and predictable price signal to businesses, investors, and consumers. All of these economic actors will look for ways to reduce their carbon footprint through energy efficiency and low-carbon sources of energy. This is a market-based approach which harnesses American innovation and private investment. Next comes the dividend. So the revenue collected from the carbon fee is allocated in equal shares every month to American households. And after about 10 years of the policy, this dividend would reach about $4,400 per year for a family of 4. So you can spend the dividend on whatever you want. You might spend it on energy efficiency products or saving up to buy a hybrid or an electric vehicle. But whatever you do with it, you might be spending it on health care as well, or whatever the needs are for your family. You're going to be stimulating the local economy. One estimate is that we could see as many as 2 million new jobs in 10 years as a result from the dividend, and also, of course, the investments that businesses are making to make this transition. How can we do this? How is it practical to send this dividend out? Well, this has been studied very carefully, and we have a good system for doing it. It turns out that 90% of the people already have basically some kind of account set up with the IRS to receive their tax refunds. And so basically you just issue a credit straight to that account. For the other people who don't have that, they can use debit cards and they'll get their carbon dividend that way. And the thing is, you won't have to really send paper checks out except under very rare circumstances. So that means we can keep the administrative costs for this whole thing very low. After about year 5, you would see only about 2% of the revenue being collected used for the administrative overhead. All right, let's talk about a third pillar of the program. This is the border carbon adjustment fee. What this says is that imported goods will pay a border carbon adjustment fee unless the country of origin has the same price on carbon that we have here in the United States. So this means American jobs stay here and other countries have a strong incentive to enact policies that are very similar. Because think about it, if you're in China and you're going to export goods here, you have your choice. You can either set up a carbon fee in China and then recycle those revenues within your own country, or you're going to be paying a tariff to the United States. So that's kind of a no-brainer. Other countries are going to follow suit. How do we do this? Well, this again has been studied very carefully, targeted where it needs to go. So the adjustment would apply not to we don't have to track every single widget that's coming across the border, right? What we do is we apply it to energy-intensive, trade-exposed goods. This means goods for which the cost related to energy is greater than 5%, and for which the market, more than 15%, is traded internationally. So this means primarily goods like aluminum, cement, iron and steel, these kinds of materials. The bottom line is we have a way to maintain a level playing field internationally, and to bring the entire international community along with us as we make this transition. Now, who's in favor of this policy? Well, as far as we're talking here now generically about the whole idea of carbon fee and dividend, there's tremendous agreement among economists. Over 3,500 economists have signed onto a letter saying that the most effective and the most economical way to deal with climate change is to put a price on carbon emissions. This is the largest public statement of economists in history. You can see a list there of some of the people who have signed on to it. While we're talking about the concept of endorsements, I'm also pleased to tell you and share with you the news today that last Tuesday, the Toledo City Council voted to endorse carbon fee and dividend as a way of dealing with climate change. And we're very happy about that, but we're especially happy that it was a unanimous vote by the council, which sends a very strong signal. And Cincinnati, by the way, has also endorsed. And a fun fact for you, 169 breweries across the country have endorsed carbon fee and dividend. And if you want to think, why are breweries caring about climate change? Well, meet us for happy hour this Friday, and we'll explain. The key word is hops, okay? Hops is the word. Moving on, I just want to say, let's get back on the path to security here. How can you help out with this effort? Well, there is no end of ways you can help. If you want, you can join us at Citizens Climate Lobby. We'd love to have you. There's a website here where you can go and click. We've got over 150,000 supporters across the country. We'd love you to become the next ones. You could come to a CCL meeting. As Tom was mentioning, we have chapters here locally. It started out, we had a joint Perrysburg-Toledo chapter. Now we have actually spawned off split off a separate chapter for Toledo itself. We have the Perrysburg chapter. We're forming a new one down in Findlay and Lima as well. So we're going to have 3 chapters now in Northwest Ohio. You can write a private letter to your member of Congress. You could join us at a local lobby meeting at a district congressional office. We love to have business leaders, of which there are many here in the room, endorse this bill as prominent individuals in the community. So there's a place you can go to the Energy Innovation Act website, and you can do a personal endorsement. Of course, we'd love to also have you bring us out either to your business, your nonprofit organization, your school, anywhere to speak to you about this, and have you bring your organization in and endorse as an organization as well. So I want to just close with these thoughts for you, and then we'll have a lot of time for questions. So Rotarians have done outstanding work in so many areas to improve the lives of so many. And I ask you to reflect for a moment on how much of that work is now at risk because of climate change. If you're working to ensure that people in developing countries have clean water to drink, then you need to have a plan to address climate change. If you're working to reduce the spread of disease, you need a plan to deal with climate change. Or if you're working to promote economic development, strengthen communities, or ensure a better future for our children, then you definitely have to have a plan to deal with climate change. So today, I'm offering you the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, and if we can go back to the slide one more time. With your help, we'll all find our way back home safely. Thank you very much for your attention. My contact is here, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
First of all, it was really a great talk. My question is, Europe has had a similar program over the past 10, 15 years. What's the success of European countries in this effort?
So the question is, what do we know about programs like carbon fee and dividend from what other countries have done? So here's what I can share that I know. The most cited example of a previous use of carbon fee and dividend was in British Columbia in Canada. So they've had one there for, I think, about 10, 15 years perhaps. And the results were that they found no problem in their economy. There was no downturn in the economy as a result of introducing the plan. And they were successful in bringing emissions down quite a bit. So that's one very good example that in British Columbia they were able to enact this plan. I think you were specifically asking about Europe, is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes.
So
yes.
in Europe, I'm not familiar with which countries have carbon fees there and at what levels. So I can't speak directly to Europe, but I know that British Columbia is often cited as a very positive example of how the plan can work.
I understand the European Union has that. EU has a tax like that.
So yeah, the European Union, I can't speak to that. There are a lot of programs going on in Europe, in individual countries as well as the EU. So I'm afraid I'm not able to specifically respond there as far as how it has worked out in the EU.
Thank you.
Certainly their economy, we know, is doing quite well.
Okay, thanks very much for coming today. There was a graph that you had where you showed sort of the baseline and then what you believe is likely to be the case.
Yeah.
I'm just curious on how you came up with that likely to be the case scenario, and under the peak level that we would reach, look like in 2030 or 2040, what would that mean in terms of the increase in ocean height? For example, what would it do to Florida? What would it do to, and that again, that's not the baseline that you said was we're likely to come down from there, but the one we think is the most likely scenario.
Right. So the question is, how do we actually lay out these scenarios about what's likely to happen, how much temperature increase, and what's going to happen with ocean and sea level rise? So these things are studied primarily by a body called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, sponsored by the United Nations, which is a group of both scientists and also government representatives that all have to agree when the documents are published. So they lay out different scenarios about what's going to happen, how much temperature increase we're going to get, according to different emission reduction plans. So as far as the sea level increase is concerned, we've already sort of locked in at least probably a foot to foot and a half of sea level increase by 2100. Even under the best case scenario, that's what we're likely to see. If we don't take ambitious action like we're describing here, and we kind of are on sort of the current policy pathway, which gets us to about 3 degrees C of warming, you could see substantially more sea level rise, more heading up toward 4 feet, 6 feet of sea level rise by 2100. So yes, all these things are laid out in documents. There was a special report that came out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's their 1.5 degrees C report. So what do we have to do? Why is it important to keep warming below 1.5 C? And what do we need to do to get there? And that report came out, I think it was a year ago, October. So if you Google and look for that report, the 1.5 C report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that will lay out a lot of details for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I think I'm going to be a devil's advocate. And I'm not talking politically, I'm talking from friends, close friends of mine who are top scientists in Israel and in the United States. Mm-hmm. So first question is a general question of vocabulary. 15 years ago, it was global warming. Now, you didn't say once, you said climate change. Why suddenly climate change? Where is the global warming?
Right.
Okay. The second question is, there's absolutely no proof by anybody that all the examples that you showed, the North Pole, the fields in Ohio, the thing that it didn't happen like, say, 20,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. You're only showing things that seemingly are happening now, but we don't know what happened before. Uh-huh. There's absolutely no question that it's a cyclical thing, that it happened many times before. You actually showed one of the slides that shows cyclical thing. You don't know that in, say, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, it will drop again.
Okay.
1975 was a big article in Newsweek, you're probably familiar with it, that scientists, United Nations scientists, prove that the world is cooling, and the language in the article, I can send it to you, is identical to the same language that we use today for climate change. Mm-hmm. All the disasters will happen thing. Now, I live in Ohio, but I also live near the sea in Israel.
Yes.
And I was in Seychelles 2 years ago, and I was in Maldives 2 years ago. We were warned about rising sea. I can tell you from my eyes that it did not move even 1 millimeter from where it is. People who live in Florida didn't, although it was stated about 15 years ago that Miami by now will be underwater. Didn't move a millimeter. Okay? And I'm holding two beautiful paintings by Holbein from the 17th century of River Thames in London, which was totally frozen. There are kiosks on it, and people are skating and all kinds of things, literally on the river. By the 18th century, it melted. Nothing to do with the Industrial Revolution, with fossil fuel. There was no fossil fuel. There was no Industrial Revolution, and that happened. So, you know, and the last question, sorry, it wasn't a question, it was a lecture. The last question, the decision in Paris is to reduce by 2 degrees by the year 2040, 50, I don't know, whatever. From where? Is there a line, a global line that from which you can evaluate 2 degrees up or 2 degrees down? I mean, it's a total ridiculous. Anyways, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. Let me try to take them one by one. So, you know, and I really appreciate you speaking out, because there are many, many people who have exactly the same questions that you're raising right now. So let's talk about the vocabulary. That was the first question. What is this business about calling it climate change, and why aren't we calling it global warming anymore? So let's be clear. What's happening is, in fact, global warming. The reason why the language was changed is that there was an attempt to communicate that what we're going to see is not just somehow temperatures increasing everywhere, and that's all there is to it. There are many complex effects going on, like the precipitation effect that I mentioned earlier, right? So when the Earth heats up, we evaporate more water from the oceans, we evaporate more water from the land, and you get changes in precipitation patterns. So there are many different effects associated. In fact, one of the leading climate scientists, Katherine Hayhoe, likes to refer to it as global weirding. In other words, that we're going to see changes in patterns that we've been used to in many different ways. So that, I think the attempt to call it climate change rather than global warming is not really an attempt to hide the fact that the Earth is warming. The Earth is definitely warming. It's just in a way to communicate that there are effects that are playing out in different ways in different areas. Areas that are dry now are expected to get drier. Areas that are wet now are expected to get wetter. And this is what climate science is to model these effects and try to understand and see what's going to happen. Your next question was, why do we think that this is not a natural cycle? We've seen natural cycles before. Isn't it possible that this is another natural cycle that's just going to reverse itself over time? In other words, why would we go to all this effort if it's just something natural? So I can assure you, this has been looked at extremely carefully, because many people, again, have raised this question. The cycles that I showed you were over 800,000 years. Those are the ice ages, and carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere going up and going down. But as I demonstrated in the plot, they never got above 300 parts per million in all those 800,000 years, right? But now they are. We can measure the carbon dioxide concentration, and we know it's at 410 parts per million. It's well above anything that's natural. So this is coming from the burning of all the fossil fuels that we are responsible for as a society. And so it's very important. This is a crucial point, right? This is human caused. And we can look at the different scientific authorities. For example, we can look at the National Academy of Sciences. Right? The National Academy of Sciences is set up to do reviews of the most important scientific questions that we have. They have reviewed this. They have confirmed, yes, the Earth is warming, it's caused by humans. But if you don't trust scientists, and many people don't, I really ask everyone to think seriously about what's going on, with the oil companies. The oil companies like ExxonMobil and Shell and BP, they all confirm the Earth is warming. It's caused by the burning of fossil fuels. These corporations have the best scientists. They have real lobbyists, not fake lobbyists like me. They have everything. If they thought there was a credible case to be made that this was not caused by humans, that it was some natural effect, they would certainly make that case and they would oppose any policy changes. But in fact, ExxonMobil favors putting a carbon fee and dividend policy in place because they acknowledge this is caused by humans. So I'm happy to talk further about this with you, but the other examples that you cited about changes over time, that goes beyond the scope of what we can discuss today. But I think the overwhelming weight, not just of the science, but from business and industry, these voices are all telling us we need to act. Please.
I kind of on the front that we just heard. How clean is a semi-truck today compared to what it was 20 years ago?
So that I can't really speak directly to. I'm sure the emissions have been improved. I mean, there are all these emissions standards that have been put on. I'm mostly familiar with that with respect to automobiles. I don't know how they apply to semis. I can tell you, I'm sorry, the question was, for those who didn't hear it, are semi-trucks cleaner today than they were 20 years ago in terms of their emissions? I'm sure semi-fleets are all looking to get fuel efficiency because that reduces their cost. So I'm sure they've looked at that in terms of their designs. But I can tell you that there's a lot of buzz now about electric vehicles and autonomously driven vehicles. And I know that there's certain thoughts of that going as far as truck transport as well. So it may be that at some time in the future we're going to have more electric-powered vehicles, even including trucks and buses and so on. And then if you're generating the electricity to recharge those batteries with clean energy coming from low-carbon sources like nuclear, solar, or wind, you can have transport without having the carbon emissions. Another option, of course, to make them cleaner is to generate biofuels, and people are doing research on that. So our bill doesn't attempt to pick out a winning or a losing technology. It attempts to set out a market incentive, and we trust that American innovators are going to come up with all these technologies, whether it's biofuels or electric trucks, to make everything lower in carbon footprint to make this transition.
Okay, to let you know that trucks today the air coming into a truck is dirtier than the air coming out of the exhaust.
Oh, really?
For the last 4 to 6 years, that's been that case.
Wow.
We can do all we can and to saddle Americans with what you're wanting to do, but if China stays dirty and charging that tax on China is only raising our prices more, what China does now today offsets what we've done in the last 10 years of keeping our country cleaner. So how do we get China to do more cleanup? China, India, Vietnam. Just adding a surtax on top of that is not enough to offset the pollution that they're doing. I heard not too long ago that we've dropped our pollution by over 20% in the last 6 years, but China's pollution has gone up and totally offset what we've done.
Okay, good question. So the question is, how do we bring other countries along with this? If the United States acts alone, don't we risk basically having our efforts canceled out by increasing emissions from other countries like China? Another very good question. So yes, we definitely agree that we need international effort. There's no way to solve this problem without bringing all countries on board, especially major emitters like China. The issue of what's going on in China is wrapped up with their economic development and the way the treaties have been written and the agreements of the Paris Accord up till now, recognizing that China is a developing country. They're trying to lift their people out of poverty, and they're focusing on the energy sources that they have available to make that happen. The provision in the bill that I mentioned that's going to provide a strong incentive for other countries to follow suit is that border carbon fee adjustment. As I was explaining, we are actively trading with China, of course, and with many other countries. And once we have the border carbon fee adjustment in place, this will be a very strong incentive for China to put a carbon fee in place in their country that matches ours. They're not going to want to pay tariffs at the border just to get their products imported into the United States. I'm not saying that this will do it by itself, but I'm saying that this will be a very strong push. Obviously, there has to be negotiation as well and engagement of the United States with other major countries. We all have a huge stake in this, and we certainly all need to act together to bring our emissions down.